believe it or not. It's our 36th year. I want to get that on the recording. Started in 1989. And we met monthly, generally from September to May, talking about so many subjects we can't remember all of them, but covering a lot of material. So today we're going to be talking about secularism. And before we do that, I'd like to have everybody introduce themselves. I'm Bon Clayton from Colonial Church of Edina, which is a member of the United Church of Christ and other congregational denominations.
I am Hafiz Mahmood. I'm Muslim, and I'm the Muslim co-chair of the Interfaith group from Islamic Center of Minnesota.
John Spalding. I'm a member of St. Paul's Evangelical Lutheran in Minneapolis.
Fuad Naeem. I'm a professor of comparative theology and Islam at the University of St. Thomas, St. Paul.
Saudi? Oh, you're muted.
I am Saudi Ahmed Saudi. I am a Muslim from Islamic Center of Minnesota.
Sean?
I am Sean Thompson. I am a Muslim, and I am the vice principal of Sofa Academy and the core team lead of Embrace Minnesota.
I am, Farouk Mia. I'm a Muslim. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
And Janet?
Janet French, St. Paul's Lutheran in Minneapolis.
And
Herman.
Herman.
Herman Weinlich, Minneapolis. I'm a retired pastor of the Moravian Church.
Okay, I have a tablet that I was going to pass out, but there are not very many people here, but at least the ones that are here might sign in. I would also like to, maybe you could write down the ones that are on the screen. Can you do that?
Yeah.
Okay, so as I said, the topic is secularism. I think that's a very important topic for our age. And so we'll get right into it. Our first speaker is John Spalding, the Christian Perspective.
Okay. All right. My title is Secularism, a Christian Perspective. That's the title I usually use for any presentation that I make, but this is a very particular, this is one particular Christian perspective that I'm talking about today. Not one of my own invention, but a discussion of an important one. A full account of secularism in Western culture would require a cultural history of the last 1,000 years or so. That's beyond my ability and beyond the scope of our discussion. Instead, I will present highlights of one major treatment of the subject. And this is Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor's book, A Secular Age, which came out in 2007. I worked my way through it some years ago, and would require some weeks to do so again. But for today, I'm relying on a kind of 140-page cliff notes to Taylor. James A.K. Smith's book, How Not to Be Secular, Reading Charles Taylor, which came out 10 years ago. Taylor's is certainly not the only way the subject can be approached, but it's a provocative one. Full sense of secular was simply the temporal, what is related to earthly life. Entering modern times, especially with the Enlightenment, secular took on the sense of a non-sectarian, neutral, a-religious space, a public sphere governed by universal neutral rationality. This is probably how most people understand. For Taylor, the rise of secularism is not the popular quote-unquote subtraction story that as science's achievements have multiplied over the last several centuries, belief in God or the transcendent has become less and less plausible. In the subtraction story, the point of this process is assumed to be religion's inevitable decline in the face of scientific and materialist explanations of reality. Secular and religious belief and unbelief are seen in opposition. Taylor contends that far from being the inevitable product of such a simple process, today's secularism has been constructed from many currents of thought, many events, and many choices over the course of centuries. Our secular age, which is the title of his book, is not now characterized by a simplistic conflict between belief and unbelief. Instead, there has been a change in the conditions that make something believable or unbelievable. All beliefs are now contestable. Every religion is one among many. Rival stories are always available. The burden of proof is on believers, and there is no going back to a situation where this does not apply. Taylor asks, how did we move from a condition where in Christendom, people lived naively in a theistic construal to one in which we all shunt between two stances, in which everyone's construal shows up as such, and in which, moreover, unbelief has become for many the major default option. Now that description, unbelief being the major default option, certainly applies more to some communities than to others. For example, it's more the case in Western Europe than in the US. But unbelief is clearly the default in the circles which dominate our culture today. Taylor notes three main obstacles to unbelief in the medieval period. Nature pointed beyond itself to God. Society's hierarchy was grounded in divine authority, and the world was felt to be enchanted, that is, open to what lies beyond the visible and the material. Pressures for religious reform in the late medieval and early modern period, including the Protestant Reformation, were as a decisive impetus for change. Reformers rejected the hierarchical religion of the medieval church. Ordinary people, not just clergy and monks, were meant to have a relationship with God and to be expected to live by the precepts of the gospel. Rejection of Catholic sacramentalism opened the door to naturalism. With no enchanted social order, people felt free to reorder an increasingly disenchanted world. Protestantism sought to make the world over to higher standards, but the reform shattered the unity of Christendom religiously and politically. The wars of the 16th and 17th centuries, fought often along religious lines, caused many thinking people to conclude that religious conflict was socially destructive and that society would be more productively ordered on non-sectarian principles. Taylor identifies a modern moral order, that's his term, beginning in the 17th century, starting with theories of government based on natural law, independent of any specific religious claims. Concern increasingly shifted away from any divine goal for history or for human spiritual transformation and toward promotion of human flourishing here and now. This is a quote from The Secular Age. The economic dimension takes on greater and greater importance, and economic, in quotes, that is, ordered, peaceful, productive activity, is more and more the model for human behavior. This development was accompanied by circumscribing God's role to that of providence, a God mainly concerned with human well-being rather than eternal ends. Specifics of Christian belief were reduced in defense of a more generic deity. God was seen as creator of a system that runs without him. God is personal and active in the world became an aspect of what was called enthusiasm, a negative connotation. Distaste grew for the idea of a God who interferes in the natural world where human activity carries on. Deism, the religious expression of such thinking, was an easy station on the way toward unbelief. Its scaled down God and pre-shrunk religion could be easily abandoned. It is at this point, probably by the late 18th century, that Taylor sees what he calls exclusive humanism becoming a live possibility. Political order could be liberated from any specific religious authority. The moral order of mutual benefit could provide society with moral goals. Christian morality was secularized as humans were deemed capable of fulfilling its principles on the basis of reason and by their own powers. Sectarian differences faded as people agreed in the pursuit of mutual material benefit. What Taylor calls the immanent sphere grew in importance and confidence. Reference to transcendence was admissible only as it reinforced this new order. Scientific advances did reinforce it as people began to think in terms of universe instead of cosmos in the older sense. Space, think of space instead of place, the whole concept of space out there. With exclusive humanism, secularism no longer simply means a neutral, rational social space. Instead, secularity purports to describe the way things are. Concerns for eternity and transcendence are effectively eliminated without giving up the moral project of human flourishing here and now. Meaning and significance should be possible without any reference to God or the transcendence. And these are some of his favorite terms. We get a buffered world with a buffered self. The world and the self are buffered against God, against anything transcendent, anything above the material. But in reality, according to Taylor, exclusive humanism fails to realize that it now participates in a new condition. Secular existence is haunted. People feel malaise, a sense of something lost, a discomfort with the flatness of life. In a system that supposedly excludes the transcendent, people invent myriad ways to seek for it. Some find being alone in the universe to be liberating. With nothing telling us what to do, we can decide for ourselves. If God or the universe impose no meaning, we can create our own. We can create ourselves. And certainly we see this everywhere nowadays. For Taylor, exclusive humanism does not in fact describe the way things are. But he nevertheless insists that believers, as well as unbelievers, now live in the immanent frame that secularism has constructed. Our society functions, and most of the time so do we all, tacitly assuming that the world functions without explicit reference to God. And I was just thinking today, I turn the lights on or I go on the internet and just assume that the system is going to work. I don't pray that the electricity will come through or that the internet will work. I mean, sometimes, when I've got problems, I do, but, we assume that the world is going to function in a way that people in a previous age most likely did not in the same fashion. For Christians, honesty about this should push us to examine how our thinking and behavior have been shaped by forces alien to our faith. And recognizing that all belief is now contested belief, we must examine anew why we believe and how to communicate our faith with persuasive integrity when it no longer has privilege. So that's my focus.
Okay, thank you. So, Dr. Fuad.
Greetings, assalamu alaikum. I'll be speaking about Islam and secularism. Whatever it's called.
Yeah.
This is one perspective from a Muslim. Something like secularism is both I would argue, a theological and historical reality, and there could be approached from many different vantage points. So first of all, there is no term in classical Arabic, Persian, or other Islamic languages that Muslims have used, synonymous with the term secular. One reason for this is that there is a difference, even theologically, which then had, I would argue, sociological or social implications between Islam and Christianity, or rather in Christianity, there was a clearer distinguishing between the sacred and the profane. For example, as in Jesus' saying, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. So it's from Matthew 22:21, but it's also found in a couple of the other documents like Mark. In Islam, everything belongs to God, and thus everything is in principle sacred. There's no separative sphere of human life that can be called secular. Metaphysically, Islam has a unitary perspective based on the oneness of the divine, it's called Tawheed, in which all aspects of life are governed by and unified by a common center, a common reality, which is God, or Allah. The term Allah is, sure, you're familiar, is, I'm using it I'm using the word God for Allah. I know there's some debate about that, but if anybody wants to talk about that, we can do that later. So this means that not only that which directly relates to what is commonly considered religious in the West, such as religious beliefs or acts of worship or religious traditions and holidays, whatever we generally call religious in English nowadays, is religious in Islam. So all that is religious. But in the Islamic tradition, the category of religious is much wider, one could say. That every aspect of life is permeated by the sacred, ideally speaking at least, and can be considered a part of religion. Theologically, this is because everything comes from God, and therefore everything bears his imprint. He has made it for a purpose, and it's additionally, God is ever present to the world, one could say, and always witness. One of the names of God in the Qur'an is Ash-Shahid, the witness to all his creation. Thus, all human activities either conform to the will of God or do not. Another way of putting it would be largely that all human activities, all human endeavor, and even natural, beyond the human, everything pertains to God. But speaking of human activities, all human activities either conform to the will of God or they do not. Thus, politics, economics, social life, science, art, and every other human endeavor and activity is directly related to God, in that human beings can undertake these activities or endeavors in ways that either conform to God or do not conform to God. They conform to God's will, God's purpose, and God's good pleasure, or they do not. That is why Islamic law, for example, regulates all human actions. So don't want to get too deeply into Islamic law, but scholars have divided all human actions into 5 categories based on the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That every action you do is either obligatory, recommended, neutral, discouraged, or forbidden. Therefore, all actions are encompassed by religion. So, from this perspective, from the outlook of Islam or even the Islamic civilization, where does what we today call the secular come from? So, theologically, it is that the origin of which is not only mere, I think there's a typo here, merely human, but it comes from a human source that is cut off from anything higher than itself. Because as we saw, if something is just human, that for ideally speaking, that should still be religious in an Islamic context. But it comes from a human source that is cut off from anything higher than itself, that is merely human, and thus it is cut off from God. So the origin of secular or secularity from a theological perspective in Islam comes from a way of life, a way of looking at the world, a perspective that is only human, that is cut off from anything higher, any notion of something beyond, something transcendent. So Islam teaches that humans were made to remember and worship God and follow completely his ways, to be his representatives. Khalifa is the Quranic word, on earth. And this is the very purpose of religion. Religion is something that God has sent repeatedly, according to the Qur'an and Islamic tradition, in history through the various revelations. And the purpose in each revelation is to remind humans of this divine mandate, that human beings are made to remember and worship God and organize their lives and achieve their fulfillment ultimately through that. That they will only actually achieve their fullest fulfillment through the worship and remembrance of God. And that is the goal of all religion. Historically, now turning from theological to historical, historically the secular has been present wherever human beings have relied on their own devices and desires without reference to any sacred or transcendent norm or inspiration. Muslims historically came across various forms of the secular, from the earliest era when Arab paganism was largely based on tribalism. Even the religion was very, what you can say, this worldly. It did not really have even this Arab paganism was largely, even when it expressed itself in supernatural language, was deeply tied to tribal society and its goals, and had very little, one could say, spiritual content. As Islam spread and encountered political institutions and intellectual ideas from foreign civilizations, Islam spread very widely, so it encountered lots of different non-Islamic civilizations. For example, the Greek, the Persian, especially those two, but also Indian, Chinese, and so forth to a lesser degree. Muslims either adopted these to Islamic models and norms or sifted through them, keeping only that which conformed to the Islamic perspective and leaving aside that which didn't, which appeared to be, quote unquote, secular, one could argue. So, for example, in philosophy, Muslims, the Muslim translation movement was one of the largest in world history of translating all sorts of books from the Greek, oftentimes through the help of Christians in the Islamic world who spoke Syriac, to Arabic. And this was a process in which was not just mere translation, but it was also these works were, one could argue, Islamicized, or they're brought into conversation with or integrated into an Islamic worldview. And in this perspective, for example, Muslims embraced Plato and Aristotle, largely because, I would argue, because they could readily be integrated into monotheistic beliefs and a monotheistic ethical perspective, as opposed to, say, just Pyrrho, who was a skeptic, or the Cynics, or Epicurus, who thought that pleasure was the goal of all human life, because these perspectives were either through ethics or through belief, not compatible with any of the Abrahamic traditions and with Islam. But the secular, that's some of the historical secular, some of which is not secular, that Muslims encountered, but the secular as we know it today, modern secularism, is, I would argue, a whole new thing. It comes from the creation of a whole civilization and worldview that is really anomalous in world history. Meaning that nowhere, if you go anywhere, you could go Native American, Aboriginal tribes, you can go into even prehistory as much as we know about pre-modern societies, or you can go to the great ancient civilizations. Nowhere was do you find, other than some people here or there, any society based on what we call secular today? Any society in which there were people did not have a deep, did not base their life on the transcendent, on the spiritual, in which the superhuman or the supernatural did not play a role, right? So in other words, human beings have, as far as we know, have always been religious in one way or another. They might debate amongst themselves what religion is true or false, or what religion means, but there was never a society before modern Western civilization or modern Western secularity which was completely based on secularism, in the sense of being cut off from a religion. Secular, as you know, as Reverend Spalding also mentioned, it can be defined in various ways, and Taylor does it in a particular way. Sometimes secular can be seen as either irreligious, in the sense that, you know, it's that which is not religious. But I would argue that historically, the way that it developed in the Western world, it was largely anti-religious, and it's been used in that kind of way, actually worldwide. Secularism, as we know today, comes from the development of modern secular modernity, firstly in Europe, through a number of different movements that maybe you can talk about later. I don't have time to deeply go into it, such as Renaissance, which the Renaissance, in which I would argue humanism really first, a perspective in which humanism resurfaced. It was almost like, for various reasons, the pagan past of Europe, of the Rome and Greece, could not be killed off for various reasons, perhaps, what at least some have argued, by Christianity, and it resurfaced, or maybe it was revived. Well, you know, that we can talk about that. But so the Renaissance brings back a kind of humanism. You can see, for example, in the art, just you know, look at medieval art, which is largely has deeply a transcendent, one could say, or spiritual perspective, medieval Christian art, versus the art of the Renaissance, in which you have a very earthly, muscular people, you know, even the prophets like somewhat like Michelangelo's David could not have been produced in the medieval age. He seems like, you know, some kind of athlete. The focus is on his body, not on the spiritual dimension. But, you know, I could say more of that balance. But so the Renaissance, but also I would say even much more important than that's a scientific revolution. And this from your presentation, I mean, I feel like Taylor underplays that a little bit. That the scientific method produces a way of understanding reality, which, if absolutized in the way that it was, makes any religious claim not. It's a challenge to any kind of non-material perspective on the world. If you say that all that is true, when science does not have to say this, but oftentimes the way that science developed, some of the people, or many people who argued in this way, that if material reality is all that we can surely know, then non-material reality, you know, there's scientific method cannot apply to that. Then how do we know that that's true? And again, it's a more complicated argument, so we can come back to that as well. And finally, not finally, but also the Enlightenment, in which rationalism, that I think, you know, also mentioned in, Taylor makes that a major point of that, in which rationalism becomes central, that human beings do not necessarily need revelation or religious authority or other forms of knowledge, let's say inspiration, or even kind of spiritual understanding, comprehension, but rather rationality and reason become the way to, or the arbiters of truth, right? So this begins in Europe, and it spreads throughout spreads worldwide, including the Islamic world, largely firstly through European colonialism. right? So that's a whole other aspect of it that's not organic to other civilizations. It's been kind of superimposed, first through colonialism and then through globalization. And that's, again, a long story and a very interesting and troubling history. So unlike the ancient Greeks, who did not have military and economic power, the modern West was able to forcibly overcome the resistance of the Islamic world, and secular thought, institutions, and lifestyles were introduced during colonial rule and have been encouraged ever since through continuing, I would argue, a Western hegemony in the post-independence era of the Islamic world. But nonetheless, despite all of this power, it has not been able to eclipse religion in the Islamic world the way it has in the post-Christian West. Although the US remains an interesting, I think you mentioned that also, outlier in certain ways. So in place of God, revelation, and the transcendent destiny of humanity, secularism puts human reason and the empirical method as the arbiter of truth, and the human being as a this worldly being in quest of a perfect world, which he achieves through continuous material progress. Although secular can technically, we've already spoken of this, can mean non-religious, in the context of Western history, it's often meant anti-religious, which actually began with the opposition to and marginalization of Christianity in Europe itself. But then when secularism spread to other places in the world, sometimes it destroyed whole religious civilizations, such as in Soviet Russia, although the Orthodox Church there now has had a revival in the last couple of decades, or in communist China, where again, there was a great attempt to completely root out religion, but it didn't quite work. So now Confucianism, which had always been there, is the Chinese government has adopted it instead of trying to wipe it out, but by not calling it a religion, but a philosophy, for example. Right. So in light of this, the modern secular worldview, which challenges both metaphysics and transcendence, as well as ethical norms, two elements that I would argue all the major world religions share a commitment to, is a threat to all religious and spiritual perspectives. Whatever differences the different religious traditions may have, pale, I would argue, in comparison to the differences they have with secularism. And the threat they may perceive from each other pales in the threat that secular imposes. Conversely, in a world in which secularism has increasingly marginalized questions of meaning, purpose, and value, the religions, including Islam, have a golden opportunity to present themselves as alternatives that provide meaning and purpose to human lives and endeavors, that answer the great questions that human beings have always asked, that teach human beings how to live well and how to be the best they can be. And perhaps most significantly, they offer transcendence in a world increasingly devoid of any ultimate reference point in which reality can be construed and constructed by every individual. A couple of just last points. So another way one could approach the problem of modern secularism from an Islamic perspective is through the fundamental creed of Islam, particularly the first part of the Shahada, the testimony of faith. So La ilaha illallah, no God but God. One could argue, and there are Muslim writers who've written on this, that secularism replaces the one God with the many gods of this world, which are in reality idols, and thus leads one to shirk, which is the greatest of sins in Islam. It's taking partners onto God. And because other things become the ultimate reference point in a world in which God disappears. And of course, we can Christian writers like Paul Tillich, in his idea of the ultimate concern, have interestingly argued something very similar. Practically speaking, I'll end with this, is there a way that Muslims could deal with the challenge of secularism intellectually and not by going down a fundamentalist route, which has been a common response among the world religions to secular modernity? There's forms of kind of one can call fundamentalist, although we can talk about what that means in Hinduism and Christianity, even in a religion like Buddhism and in Islam, that are largely anti-intellectual. It's about kind of practicing religion as a form of practice, but these perspectives often do not, they just reject secular modernity, which is understandable, but do not provide much of an intellectual alternative to it. Rather than focusing just on, okay, we're going to just reject the world and we're just going to focus on practicing religion. That might work for a particular individual, but in the long run, I would argue that it's not sustainable, and it will make secular modernity kind of triumph over religion. And this actually was tested by Christians in the West, and didn't always work. All right, I'm going to. So there's another possibility is for Muslims to do what they did with, say, the Greek heritage or other forms of foreign knowledge that came into the Islamic world, which is to intellectually confront it, to intellectually understand it, engage it, take that which can be integrated into an larger Islamic monotheistic perspective, and sift out that which cannot, and also use the intellectual resources that are found in the larger Islamic tradition, Qur'an and Sunnah, but also the great works of the Muslim theologians and philosophers and other writers and intellectuals of the past to debate contemporary secularism. All right, I'll stop with that.
Okay, thank you. John, do you have any questions of Fuad?
Not questions really, but some comments certainly. In biblical faith, everything belongs to God. In the Lord's Prayer, the prayer that Jesus gave, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." So I mean, there really is no difference in that regard, I don't think, between Christianity theologically and Islam. That whatever the Apostle Paul says, "You are not your own; you were bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body." I mean, there isn't scripturally a warrant for bracketing the religious and the secular. Part of it in the West, I think, grew out of the fact that the Christian church became an institution, first opposed to the Roman Empire, later entangled with it, and at odds with secular or political institutions. So that's a complicated history, but I think what you said about the origins of modern secularism are really right on. Science, the scientific revolution did not begin as an anti-God movement. I mean, Kepler, Newton, they were all deeply religious people.
Einstein too.
Wanting to think God, we're thinking God's thoughts after him. But the possibility was there for just drop God out. And a lot of I think that's why Taylor emphasized there were a lot of decisions made along the way that took things in one direction rather than another. Also, you made your point, the human being is this worldly being in quest of a perfect world. And that has a counterpart in Taylor again. He sees secularism as having what he calls an agape analog. Agape love, of course, is the supreme virtue in the New Testament, God's self-giving love. Well, you can imitate that, if you will, in thinking in all kinds of causes for worldly benefit. What's missing, of course, is the idea of grace or forgiveness. You have to push on if you're going to succeed. And then in regard to you saying that secularism replaces the one God with many gods in this world, I would add that as we see things nowadays, it really replaces the true God with the self as its own God. I mean, the primordial temptation of the human being to be his own God. You talked about the fundamentalist group not being perhaps ultimately productive. There was a quote, I think it was in Smith's book, I don't know if it's out in Taylor or not, but he's talking about the early reaction against scientism and how Christian apologetics developed in a fundamentalist way. We said there's really no one so modern as a fundamentalist because they're arguing in the terms of that are set by the secular challenges. And then if this Islamization of knowledge movement is interesting too, because I was thinking in terms of modern movements, some more explicitly Christian, some not. For example, intelligent design. I mean, seeing the impossibility of a materialist explanation for life, for example, it just does not work. So there are just a lot of comparisons here that I think are fruitful, and I tend to agree that both Christianity and Islam, the real threat is a godless worldview. So thank you. I appreciate what you words you.
Well, did you have a comment or a question for John?
Yeah, I want to respond to a couple of things. Like just one comment or couple of things he mentioned that also mentioned a couple of things. But so one, so I understand the idea of that this theologically no difference, and in the Christian theology, God is Alpha Omega, but I think I would argue that from, and this looks like that from Islamic perspective as well, perhaps historically, that the theology was different than the practice. And I think you allude to that with the church institution, but from a kind of a Muslim angle, I would argue that not having a religious law, what Islamic law, and the Christians have arguments against the law, and this goes back to St. Paul, but by not having a law, whole aspects of society were left kind of to their own devices. And maybe when there was a strong enough church or strong enough a more moral kind of society that could rein that in, that it worked. But once that was not there, those aspects of society just kind of went their own ways and helped to produce the kind of secularism that we have today. While if there's a law that regulates everything from politics to economics, at least in principle, of course it never doesn't, it helps to integrate all of life into true religion. Anyways.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, that is a key difference between Christianity and Islam. That Christianity, we're supposed to be living by the Spirit, not the letter of the law, which doesn't always work.
Yeah. That's
and on the other hand, I suppose adherence or obeying the law does not necessarily reflect what's in the heart.
Yeah, and that's why one could argue even with the Islamic traditionists argued that one of the Jesus's main teachings was a critique of the overemphasis on the law in the Jewish tradition, and you can kind of break that. Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, wrote, that there was he argues that there's an overemphasis on law it came to be in Judaism, and then Christianity was supposed to be the corrective, but then there was underemphasis on it and overemphasis on just pure spirituality, and Islam tries to break that. At least that's the opinion of one Muslim scholar. But other than that, I appreciated your paper. It was a good summary of Taylor.
Yeah.
And I'd looked through this book, but I hadn't fully read it. Fully read it. So there's a number of things which are I think I agree with a lot of what Taylor says. Perhaps I would say that which I think Ali mentioned that there's I think that also speaks to what you were saying regarding science. So it was not necessarily a problem that Newton and Kepler and Copernicus and were all very very serious Christians, and there have been scientists since who believe in God and are looking for where does God fit into this. It's more an issue of the scientific method, which sometimes or what the term you use, scientism, the idea that science created a really a way of knowing material reality, which could not be matched by any other form of knowledge, because you could use mathematics, you could use exact observation, experiments, and so forth. And if it remained that, all right, this is just going to be a way of understanding the physical world, as it was in others. Science is not a new thing, but there's something different about modern science. I mean, so the ancient Greeks, Muslims, Chinese, a lot of civilizations practice science of various kinds. But what's different about modern science is that it very, whether advocated by scientists themselves or not, it became a way to look at all of reality, or rather, if you could not, if it was not explainable by modern science, it was no longer certain. It was no longer as doubt crept in. You cannot demonstrate the unseen, for example. You can't, and so I think it was actually science becoming kind of scientism, or a way to explain all of reality,
or a claim to it.
Yeah, the claim, exactly. Right. So I think I think I want other people to be able to come in as well. But I will ask you one thing. So this is a presentation of Taylor. So I will ask you, what do you maybe something of more of, so how would you then approach, or what in the light of this history and where we find ourselves, what would a Christian perspective say on how to how to move forward with secularism? What should Christians do, or what can people of religion do about it?
Well, I think, my last paragraph here emphasizes one thing. We have to recognize and recognize that we can't assume anything on the part of other people. We can't assume a basic awareness of God or anything like that. You have to see where people are at. But the key would be to just live more deliberately, consciously in tune with God and spiritual reality, and be very careful, be very critical of how the power of secularism affects what we think, what we assume, what we just do without thinking, our values. I mean, one thing that came up, this will resonate maybe with some of the Christians who hear this, but you know, very often, you know, evangelical Christians, you'll hear, well, you need Jesus. Well, very often what people are thinking of, in order to, you know, get over your alcoholism, or, you know, find peace, or get a stable, productive life, you need Jesus. And the need is construed in terms of making their life better. You know, I mean, the eternal dimension. I mean, you want to go to heaven rather than go to hell. I mean, that's you know, that's there, but Jesus is going to help you live a better life. You know, well, that is a perspective, that is an approach of value, which essentially comes out of the modern secular mindset. You know,
right? Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. His secularism kind of claims to be neutral, so it's very easy to for religious people, I think not only Christians but people of all religions, Muslims, to not be able to see that the origin of a particular attitude, a particular way of thinking about things or looking at things or living, is actually coming from a secular perspective.
Yeah, a lot of evangelical Christianity, especially, is about me. You know.
Yeah.
And it's rather than really about God. I mean, it's about what good can this do for me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Farouk, what do you think? Hello, Farouk. Are you still with us? Saudi, what do you think?
I think Farouk left. He's not in the picture. Okay, for me, secularism is, as has been mentioned, it doesn't exist in Islam, because everything is belonging to God Almighty, and the rules are either anything being done either pro the religion or anti the religion, as has already been done. But my understanding, how we were raised, how secularism was introduced to us, which means that no religion oppresses people of other religions in the country. I mean, live and let live. So secularism was introduced in Egypt as live and let live. Everybody does whatever his religion allows him to do. And as a matter of fact, in Egypt, there are laws for Muslims and there are laws for social affairs. There are laws for Muslims and different than those for Christians and different than those for Jews. So the law is applied on Muslims is different than the one applied to Christians. Christians, for example, cannot marry more than one wife. Muslims can marry more than one wife. Inheritance laws for Christians is different than Muslims, and it's respected by the country. So this is sometimes related to that this is secularism, where everybody practices his religion the way they see fit. Mind you, back here to the United States, there is the Treaty of Tripoli, 1797. There was skirmishes between the United States Navy and the pirates of Libya in 1797, and some American soldiers and Navy crew were taken as POW. And to avoid headaches, the United States signed the Peace of Tripoli, where Article number 11 states, I quote, "As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no characteristics of that, and itself has no character of enmity against the laws, religions, or tranquility of the Muslims. As said by the United States, have never entered in any war or act of hostility against Muslims." So the forefathers told us that the United States is not focused on a specific religion, and it's open for all religions. That is here, Treaty of Tripoli, Article number 11. So this is how I look at social secularism, that live and let live. Don't force social activities on people where they can really get hurt. That's how I understand secularism. Some people consider secularism, like in France, freedom from religion.
Yeah.
But secularism should be freedom of religion, that everybody does that. I mean, one of the big leaders, it will be interesting to know, one of the big leaders who every time he takes a country, he says, don't force religion on anybody, is Genghis Khan.
Yeah.
He used to kill lots of people, but after the killing stops, he doesn't force anybody to change religion or follow a certain specific religion. So he is considered the father of secularism. That's my 2 cents.
Yes,
Yeah, go ahead.
but and so I think what you're talking about is a widely used definition of secularism, particularly in the non-Western world. For example, in India and I guess in Egypt, other places. But that's a very particular usage, I think, of secularism as a political, secularism as a kind of political system in which, in which one religious tradition cannot. It's very similar to separation of church and state in the U.S., for example, in which one religious tradition should not impose itself on other religious traditions, or that there is a variety of different. So I think that's a very specific, and that secular is used in this way. For example, in India, secularism is thought to be a is oftentimes linked with a respect for multiple religions, and not a rejection of them, but rather a acceptance of multiple religions. I think the way that we were talking about both, you know, I mean, I don't want, but how Taylor talks about it, or I'm talking about, is more of a philosophical understanding of secularism as creating a worldview or a way to live and to think about the world in which there is not, in which religion does not play a part, or which is cut off from um, uh, God, or from the supernatural, or from the sacred. And those are two different definitions of secularism. The way that you're using secularism, for example, you mentioned Egyptian law. I would argue that that's not necessarily, I mean, they might be calling that secularist, but the under Islamic law, it was something very similar that was recognized. For example, the Ottomans who ruled Egypt and many of the other Muslim countries had the millet system. The millet system, which again was based on the idea of Dhimma and Ahl al-Kitab, and the idea that multiple communities within that lived among Muslims could have their own laws, would have their own religious leaders, would practice, whatever they thought was the right ethical behaviors and so forth, including, for example, drinking or not drinking, or having wives, one or multiple wives, and so on, and many other things. And that in the Ottoman period, this was the norm. So there were multiple Christian communities with different laws. There was therefore kind of a legal pluralism. So it's not necessarily that itself as an example. It can be called secularism, and maybe it's used that way, but something like that even existed under Islamic law. But I would say the root of that goes back to that. Anyways,
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree that's an understanding of secular, which, I don't know, non-sectarian, neutral, a-religious space, a political space, which is a positive thing by and large. I mean, the reaction against the religious wars in Europe, for example, after the Reformation, and people just got tired of let's just live and let live, like Dr. Saudi said. I had an interesting experience of this when I was living in Senegal. I think this was probably 2000, around the beginning of the millennium. There was a real question of whether they wanted to define Senegal as an Islamic state. It's 95% Muslim. So this was a live issue. Of course, the small Catholic community was not in favor of this, but ultimately the Muslims weren't either, because there are two big Sufi brotherhoods in Senegal, the Mourides and the Tijans. Well, if Senegal were going to be defined as an Islamic state, which kind of Islam would run it? And they decided that probably was best just to keep it as a secular state, secular in the sense of officially non-sectarian, although there is a separate marriage options, for Muslims or non-Muslims, but an interesting experience and how that works.
Yeah, I kind of agree with the brother Saudi about my prior understanding of secularism before the presentation from both of you presenters. That maybe you're right. I was learning more from the Eastern countries, but I thought it is the perception even here. Secularism means you allow other religions to practice whichever way you want. Allow all religions. So basically, live and let live. That's what I thought. But from your presentation from both of you, to me it feels like we're talking about atheism and the godlessness. And that is to me, that was a separate concept. Secularism, I have been thinking that it is more like Indian politicians are always claiming, from where I hear this word more often. We are secular. Like to praise themselves, they will say, we are secular. That's why we allow all the religions to practice their religion, whichever way they do. And if I take that as a definition for secularism, then to me, it looks like Islam and its Sharia also has secularism in it. Because when Islam is it has rule as state, like Fuad mentioned in the Ottoman Empire, they were allowing this to other religions to practice their religions, right? Although Islam was a state religion, but yet there was permission to for anybody who wants to practice whichever religion they wanted to. So, and doing this action was also Islamic action, to allow other religions to practice whichever way they want. It's Islamic behavior in itself. So in one way, I can say Islam also has secularism in it. It allows other religions to, I mean, if you go back further in when this Christianity was the state religions, this used to be a problem to allow others to practice other religions. But when you look at those examples in which Islam was the state religion, it was able to allow others to practice their religion. So Islam basically, I would say Islam basically had more secularism in it than the Christianity demonstrated in the history.
You're using this in a very specific political way.
Yeah. I mean, this is how I took my perception of secularism.
The other religions are allowed. I mean, one could call that something else also, in the possibility of religious pluralism, or religions belong. That what people. I'm not sure if I would confuse things to say that, in my opinion, to say Islam had secularism. Is the whole. I understand what you're saying, but I think secularism is a much wider thing. It's creating a space outside of religion, so that once you have this kind of world, which is non-religious, it can then say that no one religion should dominate. And anyways, so that also means you're cutting off religion, right? So you're oftentimes means in practice that the public space religion is not and is no longer going to be a part of it. So the kind of American political philosopher John Rawls, anyways, I don't but he argues that if you come out with any kind of foundational belief or something, you can't bring it to the table. You might be informed by it. So so the secular space could be a space that actually reduces any kind of reliance on, even from political perspective, on any kind of religious claims or beliefs or practices. Ask everybody to be completely neutral. I don't think that really could work, but at least the claim is there. But
Saudi?
Yeah. Accordingly, based on what I heard, it seems that the people in the East have a different definition for secularism. And accordingly, we should introduce the term Eastern secularism and Western secularism. Why not? Because people in the East, this is the concept that has been prevailing for tens of years. And to come to say these are different than what secularism is. So secularism, as they understand it, is called, we can call it Eastern secularism, compared to what secularism really is in the West. So in this way, everybody will be happy with his definition of what's going on.
Okay, Herman Weinlich hasn't spoken. What do you want to say, Herman?
Well, I think both the presenters, particularly the first half of the Muslim presentation about there being nothing secular really. And it was mentioned in synopsis of Taylor, but when I think about Christian history, European history, an unfortunate result was that the Reformation was not very reforming, that the major reformers, Luther and Calvin, did not question the Western European assumption that the ruler determines the fate of all his subjects. And that's embodied in the Peace of Westphalia after the 30 Years' War in 1648. And it seems to me that was not really a philosophical rejection, but it was a rejection of religion at that time was felt as something forced upon people. And that is what I think people were questioning initially about secularism. But I think our question now is less about the role of government versus religion than the role of religion in culture. And the question is, do we think of our religion as a powerful force in our culture, or do we think of it as a small part, but a significant part of the culture in which we live? No.
Good. Yes, John.
Going back to what Hafiz said, are we really talking about atheism? In a sense, what we're talking about is what I've heard called living as a practical atheist. I mean, you can live a pretty normal modern life with very little reference to God. You know? Even if you aren't an atheist, even if you are a Christian or a Muslim, just in terms of how you actually function, it can be very secular. And I think that was one of Taylor's points, that we have to be aware of that tension, which is very strong nowadays, because the cultural system doesn't refer to God. Yet we are, part and parcel of it in so many ways. So it takes intentionality, it takes effort, it takes determination to live in the presence or in light of God, rather than just by default not. So I mean,
my take on it is that looking at secular as an adjective, when it's used in English, it almost always means anti-religion or anti-God, which is, in most people's thinking, pretty much the same thing. So when we look at when you look at the religions of the world, there aren't any that I know of. I've read them all, some of them many times, that say that there is a separation. The Bible does not say that there is a separation between church and state. You might look at that New Testament that way, but the New Testament is meant to be, is intended by God to be consistent with the Old Testament. And when Jesus returns, it's not going to be a democracy. So, my concern about the movement, it's a social thing. The social movement of secularism is purely anti-God. We can talk about the nuances, and which means maybe it means anti-religious, or maybe it means anti-Catholic, or anti-Islam, or anti some other religion. But what it really means is anti-God.
Pro-atheism. Can we say
Pro-atheism.
pro-atheism?
That's very
If
specific.
you can say that your goal in life is negative, yeah, that's negative.
I mean, a lot of people nowadays aren't atheists in the sense
Yeah.
that they are consciously opposed to God.
Right.
God just doesn't figure into their
Right. So what?
life.
So
Godlessness rather than.
what is happening?
That's what the secularisms you have presented that this is how
Yeah.
godlessness.
Yeah. So atheism is very specific. It's like actual, you rejected God, like saying there's no God. I will argue for the.
It's the kind of
Well,
belief.
godlessness, godlessness is just kind of, as you're saying.
Yeah.
Doesn't care.
Yeah,
Something
yeah.
doesn't
Yeah.
God is just kind of left out of the picture and nobody even notices perhaps.
We talked about modern philosophy. You want to ever hear this from modern philosophers? So if you look at the works of Rene Descartes, the founder of modern philosophy, he promoted foundationalism, which is not the same as fundamentalism. You got to separate that. Foundationalism means that the knowledge, all of the knowledge in the world, in the universe, is hierarchical, like Euclidean geometry. That's the example we use. And the foundational postulate is that God exists and he is one. That's the foundation. Now, he is the founder of modern philosophy, but so many people in the philosophical business don't want to pay attention to that, and so many others don't. My concern is that, I have to develop that a little bit more. God created two spheres. They're really not different, but there appear to be two spheres of knowledge. One is the natural world, which seems to be just out there. It confronts us every day, all the time. The other sphere is the scripture. And the scripture talks about pretty much the same natural world things. I mean, there are donkeys, and there's water. But there's a foundation. So it's foundationalism again. This is what Descartes was talking about. All of the knowledge in the universe needs to be developed in a rational way as a number theorist. I'm a mathematician, so I thought a number theory construct of hierarchical ideas, and every religion does that. Every religion goes off base every now and then because we're human, But if everything that's based on the scripture and on God's rule is part of the foundation. So my concern is a social one. God wants us to be good people and believe in Him. In the opposite way, first believe in Him, then because you love God, then you can't really imagine doing anything He doesn't want you to do. So at the same time, the world is gradually moving away from that, from God. The society is built that way. We got Karl Marx. We got. Well, I won't go into it. There's so many people in history who caused all this. God, I think, is causing us to have this temptation to go away from Him. But the only answer I can think of for us as Muslims or us as Christians is dua. We have to go out there and preach the gospel. Jesus said, go into all the world and preach the gospel. preach the truth. Tell the world about the truth of God. And this is what Muslims do when they talk to non-Muslims. They say how important God is. That's what they say. The same message. So God will have his plan. God does have his plan, and something bad will happen someday, maybe soon.
Let me share something from my experience. In 1999, I was a pastor in Indianapolis, and Billy Graham had one of his last crusades. And Muslim leaders in Indianapolis said, "This is wonderful. At least we're talking about God."
Yeah, it's God. That's the issue. That's the foundation. Everything else is built on that.
Can I take a second? I just want to introduce myself real quick. My name is Malik. And I just wanted to add what everyone else's name was on the sign up sheet.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have our
Okay.
names here.
Put your name on there, and you can read our names there too.
Sounds good. Bond.
Oh,
Bond.
I signed you in.
Okay,
I'm Bon, yeah.
I'm John.
What's your number?
I'm
What's your 14, 44?
I have 14 on.
You like the Vikings, I like 84, you know him?
Of course, I know.
My favorite.
That's your favorite?
Yep.
I don't want to say that.
I've got the 84 jersey, yep.
I need to get me one of those ones.
Yeah, you should wear that. We should all wear that.
We should. We all Viking fans in here. I better not see no Packer fans.
Well, we should.
I only watch cricket, so I don't know much about the Vikings.
The other question I just had to ask real quick. I'm Muslim. I just wanted to know what everyone else's belief was here, so I could get a little more understanding.
I'm Muslim.
Christian.
Christian.
Muslim.
On the screen here, we got, those of you on the screen, tell them what you are.
Muslim.
Muslim.
Okay, assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Who else is on there?
Sana.
Several Christians.
Sana and Stephen, Steve McMichael.
The Christian.
Okay, good. So Steve, are you done, by the way? Did you have any more?
I just wanted to introduce myself real quick. And I just wanted
What's
to-
your name again, you said?
Malik?
Malik. Oh,
Malik, hope you come back.
To be back.
Good, good. We'll talk about Randy sometime too. Okay, Steve, tell us your take on this.
I have nothing to say. I just arrived from Pittsburgh about 2 o'clock, and I just joined. I could not get on this Zoom US. It took me 15 minutes to figure out how to get on there, and I missed most of the discussion except the last 10 minutes. So I'm sorry, but I just wanted to make an appearance and get credit for my students.
you can offer
So
your own
Steve-
comments.
Hey, let me ask you a question then. I'll just, pertinent to this topic. For many years now, Christianity has been deteriorating in Europe, and now it's, I think, honestly, I have to say it's deteriorating in the United States. And people are going toward secularism. What should be done about that?
No, it's a good question because I know yeah, I don't know because it part of it is it's just so for me it's just such a complicated thing because when I look at secularism, I look at it as I think somebody mentioned, and I don't remember this. It's basically it's not sort of anti-God. It's what I experience for students especially is they just don't. It has no significance to them. I mean, they don't see any value in it. They don't. So, and I know there's a form of secularism that takes in it's sort of anti-God and so forth, but I think there's a large part, at least my experience of students, and this is what mostly I deal with, it's just apathy. And I think that's apathy that's there in Europe, especially in Italy, my experience. but I think it's here too. And I don't know how to, I mean, I try to give a reasonable explanation in class about why people would choose to be Muslim, how they choose to be Jewish, how they be Christians, but beyond that, I don't know. I mean, for me, it's very baffling. It's
Well, like I said, we're going down this path of secularism as I define it. It's anti-God as I see it, and it has other ways that it expresses itself.
well, like I said, I think there are certain forms of it that are anti-God, but I think there's a lot of it that just simply people don't feel that there's any need for it, and I think that comes from, I think, like I was talking about, from the experience of my students, it seems like it's like my career, my relationships, all that other stuff. This is enough for me. And it's not anti-God. It's just simply, it has no meaning.
Can I?
Religion
Yeah.
doesn't have a meaning.
So quick.
Oh,
And that's not really it's not really anti-God. It's just simply, they're not feeling that there's a need. And of course, I'm coming from the experience of my own personally of feeling a great need for that and a great need to teach it. But I don't know how else you convince somebody that it's worthwhile.
Yeah, convincing is the problem. Molly,
I just wanted to, I'm not familiar with the term secularism. Can anyone?
it's the part of, well, we talked about many definitions here. My own concern is that our society is moving away from God in one way or another. Some people think that it's just not important. Other people think that there's just no God, so why do you care? Why do you care about it? My own theory is that if you believe in God, you really want to do what He wants you to do. So then you do it. So anyway, that's a summary of what I think. That clock is wrong. We have another 10 minutes until it's 3:45, and then we'll talk about topics for next time. Is there somebody else you can see on there, Happy, that hasn't spoken?
Sean.
Sean, yes,
Yeah,
Sean.
Sean, you speak.
What do you say? What do you say, Sean?
I got a few things. So where should I start? I think with the idea.
Can't hear you very well, Sean.
One sec. Is that any better?
Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
Okay, sorry about that.
Better.
So I got a few things. I think first of all, starting with the definition of secularism, it's one of the rules in the past when you're engaging in a discussion to define terms. So, but in the future, when we discuss something like this, we should have a common definition that we agree on as far as the term we're discussing. Personally, I don't think secularism is equivalent to pluralism. As was mentioned before, Islam or Muslim civilizations have, in large part, always been pluralistic, in the sense that, as Saudi said and others, live and let live. And that's the project of, or one of the projects of America as well, as this pluralistic society. I don't think that's the same as secularism. I also don't think secularism is necessarily anti-God. I think that is a conflation of secularism and atheism. And it's conflated in common parlance, unfortunately. But to me, in my mind, the two are distinct. Secularism and atheism are two distinct things. Secularism doesn't have to be anti-God. The second thing is I wanted to draw your attention, everybody's attention, to a book that recently came out. It's by a professor, Dr. Sherman Jackson, who is a Muslim. And the book's title might give you a clue as to what he's talking about. He calls it the Islamic Secular. And he argues that there has always been a space for the secular in Islam. I haven't finished reading the book, so I'm not going to try to offer a summary, but his basic position is this, that you have the Islamic law or the Sharia, which governs human actions in a very concrete way. But you have and that's a bounded area. But you have outside of that this unbounded area that is doesn't necessarily fall under the purview of Sharia, under the purview of Islamic law, but it's still under what he calls the adjudicative gaze of God. It's still under the watchful gaze, or the adjudicative, judgmental or judging gaze of God. And it's a very interesting book that I've started to read it, and it's very interesting. And I think it really piggybacks off of something that Fuad mentioned earlier at the end of his presentation. Excuse me, and that of the Muslims taking on what I'll loosely call Greek philosophy, and the incorporation of largely Aristotelian philosophy, but also some Platonic and Neoplatonic thought as well, incorporating those into Islam. And this idea of the Islamic secular is similar to that. And to me, this plays into how we can actually, well, I guess the question has been positive. What can we do about it? I don't think setting up an antagonistic us versus them idea is a good solution. That's only gonna result in a further split, a further fissure between people. I really like the idea of the Islamic secular in the sense that it brings together the idea of secularism with Islam and in a larger sense, religion, kind of melding, in a sense, the two together by allowing a space for the secular within Islam and also, I said, by extension, religion. Something else I wanted to say. I had a couple questions for the Reverend Spalding. So you said at the beginning, this is a Christian perspective. Did you mean it's Taylor's perspective, or is it a certain denominational perspective? Or
I meant that it was Taylor's perspective. He is a Catholic.
Okay.
So, I mean, he is coming at this from a essentially Christian direction.
Okay. Yeah, actually, in the Islamic secular, he when he discusses secularism in the beginning, he uses Taylor quite a bit. Taylor's book, yeah.
Important book.
The other thing was you said there were 3 objections in medieval times to I had it up here. 1 second, sorry. Taylor, 3 main obstacles to unbelief in the medieval period. Nature pointed beyond itself to God. Society's hierarchy was grounded in divine authority, and the world was felt to be enchanted. Do you, or do you get a sense of how these objections were overcome?
Well,
Or were they overcome?
the society's hierarchy thing, I mean, that applied both to the church and to, you know, civil government, kings and, you know, so that was pretty much dealt with through the Reformation and, you know, the next couple centuries. The idea of a sacred basis for the governance of society, right? It came out of governed by natural law or other things. And, you know, nature pointing beyond itself to God, it still did that for Kepler, it still did that for Newton, but, you know, once you start digging into the nitty-gritty of the natural world and figuring out how it works, the temptation is there to not see it as pointing to God, but being as something that your mind comprehends and it is a subject for your understanding and your control, rather than something that evidences the glory of God. It's essentially an ethical choice in some ways. Does that make sense? Was there a third one?
Yeah, and I see the you know,
and the world is being enchanted. That's just a sense that you have about the natural world, which I think most moderns don't have. You're like, sometimes, you know, it starts to show up when I'm walking around the lake on a beautiful fall day. You know, I mean, the world is just more than what you see. You know, but most of us aren't there.
The enchanted also mean like actual beliefs that people don't, at least even if they hold don't live them out. For example, that they're angels, that there are all sorts of beings, that there's a supernatural
trolls and goblins.
Yeah, that
there are spiritual.
Yeah, and this
beings
this surrounds us. So
that-
in a certain sense, this also goes to what the last thing you were saying. I think living in the modern world, I mean, even as you know, I can't speak for everybody, but even for, you know, many Muslims I've talked to, I think in the secular space, it gets harder to imagine an enchanted world in which you're actually feeling that there's angels and jinn or whatever, you know, and the presence of God, and then nature being a theophany in the sense of, you know, something that directly reveals the signs of God. So to me, enchanted, you know, has this wider.
Yeah, I agree with that. I read all of the, well, at least 300 of the creation stories of primitive tribes in every continent, from Zulus to Lakota and so forth. And when anthropologists have gone in to look at them, the anthropologists have almost always been atheists. So they studied the religion because that's one of the essential parts of the culture. But they are confounded by it, and they start to emphasize goblins and miracles and funny practices. This is the enchantment. I think it's a pathway to loss of faith, because if you think that religion is just a combination of spiritual experiences that Pentecostals have, you are wrong. I mean, it's more than that. It's God. So I can understand how that might have been one of the modality in the medieval period. It still exists. I mean, there's a lot of it in the Philippines and South America, Africa. But it's just a misunderstanding of religion and God. God is God. Well, anyway, we have I have committed myself, and Hafiz too, who has committed himself to talking about the topics for the rest of the year. Can we finish this discussion now and go on to discussing our topics? Here is the list that I sent to Hafiz. These are mostly my ideas, so you should not assume that Hafiz and I have agreed on these. But, you know, we agreed on the first one. And these months that I've put on here are not necessarily the months that they have to be discussed, except that normally in December we discuss Jesus in the Qur'an and Bible. So is there any disagreement with doing that? So I'll put a circle around that one. I'll put a circle around September because we did that. Then we've got fasting in February. I put it there because every once in a while we do talk about fasting just before or just after Ramadan.
Yeah.
Before.
And, so I think that's instructive for Christians. I think Christians ought to fast too. So, is that okay?
Yeah, we don't have to, I mean, not necessarily just keep on talking again.
What
We
are
have
the-
a better topic, there's other topics. And definitely,
One thing that I was thinking about would be just the subject of prayer. There are similarities and there are differences, I think, in how Muslims and Christians think about prayer and practice prayer.
or we can talk
There are
about.
also kinds of prayer.
Yeah.
Understand, Dua is different than salat.
Before we get into additional ideas,
Revelations can be revelation,
could we
can be a topic.
could we have the resurrection of Jesus in April, because that's just before Easter, and we do normally have that.
I don't know, what would a Muslim, because that seems like a very specific Christian doctrine.
Yeah.
What would Muslim perspective say on that, though?
Well,
Yeah,
you
it
say
might
that
be.
you say that you disagree with that, and you don't agree with the crucifixion or the killing.
Or
But then-
maybe we can put crucifixion. If we have something in the Quran.
Or something wider, yeah, I was just saying, make it wider, a little bit wider, so that both perspectives.
Because it's more like specific to like the Christian one.
Okay, so are we agreed on April for the crucifixion of
Yeah.
Jesus? Anybody online here wants to chime in anytime?
Even with the crucifixion, that's going to be hard because there are different views as to what happened with the crucifixion.
I know we really don't come to a common understanding of that. We just talked about mostly differences.
No, I mean even amongst Islamic scholars, there are different views as to what happened with the crucifixion.
Really? I'd like to hear
Yeah.
about that. You can present that.
Are you talking about like Al-Ghazali's perspective? Or?
Taken that topic. Same Sayyidi. He said he would like to.
Or you come in.
Tamim said this one and theodicy. Also, he wants to do theodicy.
Okay, so January, Tamim and Hafiz and I agree that we should do theodicy in January.
Well, that's a good time.
Okay, are there any of these others that you?
That's also Dr. Tamim.
Theodicy is good.
The same one.
So then the questions are asceticism, honor and shame, fasting, piety, democracy. And I'd like to make at least a short case for each of them, the time we have, so that you know what I'm referring to. Asceticism is similar to piety in that we are doing things which we think God wants us to do, and asceticism and piety are described in different ways in the Qur'an and the Bible. But God wants us to separate ourselves out somewhat from the world, and that's asceticism. The Quran says, don't do it too much.
Is it not like celibacy?
Not necessarily. That's only part of that.
What
That's
are
only
the,
part of it.
many people like that this is a term that, you know, I think most people don't know what this means, other than if you studied religion or like,
Yeah. Well,
but it just, yeah.
Change the name,
asceticism
make it more easy in English.
is joining a monastery. You know, I'm a oblate of the
Or monastery.
of a monastery.
So it doesn't
How
have,
about monastery?
Steve Michael is a monk, and I think it's important for us to let people know, Muslims know what that
Actually,
is.
I'm not.
What's that?
I'm actually a friar. I'm not a monk.
Oh,
I'm a mendicant. So the difference, I'm not in a monk refers to being in a cloister, and I'm not in a cloister. I'm out. So there's a big difference in Roman Catholicism between a monk and a friar. Just to point that out.
but there are. It
It's a little bit.
Seems to me there are also traditions in Islam of people living in groups to focus on God.
It sounds like a really good topic that we could all learn from.
the other thing, asceticism, of course, is also wide. One could say something like fasting is a form of asceticism within Islam, or there's asceticism in the sense of just, you know, withdrawing from the world, or not fulfilling your ordinary needs.
Yeah.
I mean, monasticism is a
Well,
particular institution of it.
That's where I would put piety and asceticism together, because piety, one of the rules of piety in Christianity and Islam is fasting.
Piety in Islam is a very big topic.
Yeah, it's a very big topic.
It's not that.
necessarily-
If you don't want to put them together, it will become difficult for a Muslim presenter to
Yeah.
squeeze things around.
Well,
I don't think they
if you want to learn
Piety
more
is difficult.
about
Piety is the word, is taqwa.
Taqwa, yeah, which
That's
is a very broad
There's a
term.
long debate on that.
we want to
More like
know.
God consciousness.
We want to know about that.
We can do that. It's like, let's keep piety on one,
Yeah.
as one separate
How
independent
about
topic.
March then for piety?
Yeah, that's fine.
So what about October asceticism? Isn't there some interest in comparing the two? You think so?
Comparing,
Sean, would
Piety
you
and
like to take
asceticism?
that?
sorry.
What did you say? John, are you talking?
Yeah, you said comparing the two, comparing piety and asceticism, or what did you mean by that?
No, comparing Islam and Christianity in the
Oh.
term area.
Yeah,
of
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the idea.
Will you like to do that, Sean?
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay,
You have the presenter.
so we'll have that for October. And then honor and shame. That came up, it wasn't my idea, but it came up last May as a possible idea.
Yeah, how about the topic that Sean had been asking me about, Jerusalem?
Yeah, I know, it's an interesting thing to me, but frankly,
Yeah,
how could
interesting,
it,
but we need to
how
find a
could
way
how
that we
could
can
it-
avoid that.
how could it not be political? You know?
It can be
Yeah.
historical.
How about name the topic Jerusalem? Islamic perspective and
The religious perspective,
Abrahamic.
Yeah.
We can include all the three religions. We can find a Jewish
what is
presenter.
the religious significance of Jerusalem? I mean, that doesn't have to be.
Significance of Jerusalem in the three religions.
If the presenters understand that they should avoid politics, yeah.
We should. Us, we have to communicate that.
Can I suggest something? Can I suggest something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can we call it Jerusalem, history of Jerusalem until January 1st, 1980, Common Era?
1980,
That'll become political.
1900, Common Era.
1900, okay.
Until January 1st, 1900, Common Era.
1900.
Well,
That just seems extremely random to me.
No, in this way, you make sure it stays history and has nothing to do with politics.
You're avoiding the British mandate.
Before that,
If we
before
count,
that.
I think
Yeah,
spiritual
that's
and
right,
religious
you're avoiding it.
significance of Jerusalem.
Yes, avoiding the trouble.
Spiritual significance of Jerusalem should not bring in political, and you can talk to the people who are talking about it.
Yeah.
So I gave a talk at University of St. Thomas on this when this whole thing started, in which I was trying to minimize a call to do that, minimize talking about politics, although I did involve politics, but a lot of it, my way of doing it was to focus on the religion. How was it significant in Islam? Why is the Holy Land, Jerusalem, important for Muslims?
Yeah, and why it is
So how does
important to
that-
Christian, why it is important to Judaism, why it is important to something like this. I
Yeah,
think.
So what do you think of that, Saudi?
Excuse me?
What do you think of that comment? If we change the topic to not just the time span, but the religious and
Spiritual significance.
spiritual significance of Jerusalem.
I think you guys
Yes,
are wrong.
spiritual. Yes, that would be a good idea. Spiritual.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you want to
Yeah.
present
Yeah, I can do it.
in November?
Yeah.
What was Malik saying?
I was just saying, I think they were on the same page. It was just
Oh.
different ways that you guys were saying.
Yeah, I think so. You're right.
Can we go back to honor and shame? I'm curious as to what that's about.
Me too. Oh.
I'm writing this down. Just give me a
Okay.
few seconds.
So we're not doing honor and shame.
Don, can I,
Well, no,
can I ask, what are you?
who?
John?
I'm a Muslim.
Okay, so here we go. Honor and shame. Should we reassign that to a different place?
Per month.
Different month?
What is it about?
What is it?
What are you
It
talking about?
was not my idea, but you have honor killings and you have I think it's a question of whether women should wear head coverings or if it's shame if they don't. I think it's kind of a negative topic, actually.
Yeah, that's not how Muslims look at any of this. That's like external.
Honor and shame.
So let's
I don't think that. At least I would argue that that's not.
It's a very cultural perspective.
a cultural perspective.
Yeah.
so let's drop it.
I think it would be different.
Okay, then. We got fasting in February. Is that something that we can talk about Christian fasting, which is, we don't do enough of it? And we talk about Muslim fasting. Maybe Muslims would like to see more
Fasting
people
today,
fasting
we
too.
have a day of prayer and
I
fasting.
mean, it's more of like I mean, I don't know what you guys think. How would you compare the two? My question.
You could speak on it.
That's the part of the presenters. They have to bring up something. Compare it.
So what do you think? Is this a topic, January, February? Is that okay?
Yeah,
January
I
or
mean,
February?
I would say it's a good topic, but we have talked about it a few times. Well, we can still keep it, or we can switch it to something else like Revelations, or
Well,
it's the month of Revelation too, Ramadan.
Revelation?
Yeah, month of Revelation. The books have been revealed in this month as well.
You mean what is revelation in book tradition, something like that?
Yeah, Revelations. What is Revelation?
Well,
What are
you're talking
revelations?
about scriptural
New
revelation.
revelation.
Spiritual revelation.
Okay, so, let me tell you why I like democracy. Our scriptures, I mentioned earlier, scriptures don't talk about democracy. But I think there is in the Qur'an and in the Bible, a lot of foundation which would allow us, and I think does allow us to have democracy. Can we uncover that subject? Is that
There's allowance for democracy in Islam, but if you really had to pin down a political system in Islam, it's more of a meritocracy.
Which is a kind of an aristocracy?
No, meritocracy is people rise through the system by their own merit. Yeah.
So then, if we're not going to do democracy, then we could have prayer or revelation in February or May. What do you want to do?
Are we still talking?
That's in. That's in the schedule.
It's in the November schedule.
So,
Spiritual significance.
you want prayer? You want prayer to be a topic?
I like revelation between the two.
Revelation of Scripture, right?
Yeah. Well, revelation. See, in Islam, there's more to revelation than Scripture.
Yeah. Well, there is in Christianity too, but we usually say we usually say it's scriptural, but then prophetism never ends. The Pope is considered to be a prophet.
Let's talk about that.
Maybe we should discuss that.
Free from Scripture. I mean, just all.
So
All this revelation. Yeah,
So
it's called a revelation.
Just revelation.
okay, so February or May?
Bon, that is not correct. The Pope is not considered to be a prophet. It's not a terminology that we Roman Catholics use. I'm sorry, but this is not a term we use for the Pope.
I know.
That kind of surprised
We
me.
had this topic a while back,
I
and
know,
someone
right?
was saying that maybe Nelson
Sorry.
Mandela was also a prophet.
I shouldn't be speaking for the Catholic Church.
Participant.
Yes,
I shouldn't be speaking for the
the
Catholic Church.
chosen
Not a
ones.
Catholic, and he is. However, Matthew 18:18 says that Jesus says to Peter, whatever you say is true, and whatever you say is false. And that
No,
means,
that was about forgiveness. That's not about what you say. It's
well, it might be. It seems to me that speaking ex cathedra.
no. I mean, that's what Catholic tradition derives from that, but it's not, I think. Well, that's a whole nother discourse. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, I would sound we should have coffee then, Steve, and talk about that.
Yes, we should.
Maybe we should have two Christian presenters.
Yes,
Okay, so
but then we have to have the
Revelation.
Orthodox also, and then you have to have the Anglicans and
Right.
Well, we got the Pentecostals, too, and the Mormons.
Pentecostals, Methodists, Baptists.
Okay, so are we going to have Revelation in May, or is it going to be February?
February is fasting.
You want February fasting?
Could I suggest a topic?
Yes.
Yeah, instead of fasting,
just-
you can do revelation.
Because I'm very concerned. This is coming from the Christian side of things, and I think Muslims should also be very concerned about the rise of white nationalism in this country, because this is a strong movement, and I think that understanding that, I would just like to, if that's a topic that would be of interest to other people. I'm very frightened of it myself.
Well, but let's first decide
There is no room for racism.
where
in
we're
Islam.
going to be talking about Revelation. Is it February
February.
or May?
Let's make it February. Revelation.
Okay,
And May you
So-
have
so then in May we have now, and John said that prayer would be a good topic. So should we have white nationalism or prayer in May?
So let me ask a question.
what the Qur'an will say about the white nation. It only says racism, and there's no. The line is finished.
Contrary to pluralism.
So
Any type of nationalism is frowned upon. I have a question though to Stephen. Like,
Yeah.
if we discuss white nationalism, would what would you want to talk about? Like how to deal with it, or perspective
Yeah,
from
well,
the
I would like
religion,
to
or
explore with, because I have a great fear because in white nationalism, usually that does not include Roman Catholics. So I join in, uh, at least we are not to be trusted. But I just am really concerned about this country and the direction of when you've got people talking about basically, maybe white nationalism is not the right, but it's like this movement to make Christianity the official religion of the country. And there are Christians who are talking this language, and there are people, there are politicians who are talking this language.
yeah.
And this is a great danger for many of us.
I'm an old white guy, and I don't know anybody that calls himself a white nationalist or that talks about it that way.
Bon, you've got to realize they're out there.
Yeah.
You may not know them, but they're out there. This is a strong movement.
Is it religious?
Yes, it is religious.
Yeah.
Is it
Coming out of the evangelical world, and it's out there.
Well, they say that the country is founded on Christianity. Or
I know, and I know that's a fallacy there, but there's a lot of fallacies involved in it. But it's like
it's the last sermon of the prophet that states, no supremacy for black over white, no supremacy for white over black, no Arab over non-Arab, no non-Arab over. That's it. I mean,
that's why I was asking, because dealing with it from a religious perspective, it's a very simple topic. But if we discuss,
for us,
well,
maybe
maybe it's more of an inner Christian thing, but I think it also poses a danger to the country itself and democracy.
It does. It does.
It depends on how you angle.
We are running over our time here. I'm sorry about that, but John, could you say a little word about the topic of prayer?
Well, yeah, I mean, I have heard that there are some Muslims who would tell Christians, well, if you don't pray, they don't see
them putting your
at a specific time of the day. But it's just that prayer is understood in some different ways, practiced in some different ways. Its intention or purpose may have different understanding. I think it's a topic on which there would be fruitful comparison.
Yeah.
I don't understand the one piety. I don't talk about. I know the importance of that. I'm not sure just if I were doing a Christian presentation, what I would say about that, because it doesn't have the same weight. That term does not have the same.
We can talk about that some more, but hopefully we could decide to go with prayer for May, and then we'll be done for today. Okay. Anybody does it?
Yeah.
Is that okay with everybody? Our May topic will be prayer.
That's fine with me.
Okay, so we are done for today. Does anybody have any announcements or any other comments for the good?
I was just regarding the white nationalism thing. We can think about it later. I think broader things such as either nationalism or religious nationalism, racism could be topics in which that could be discussed. So
that's a
separate kind of thing.
Racism can cover white nationalism. If we took the topic of racism.
Well, we have 9 topics.
Could you remember what?
I'll send it out. Are you on our list?
Jerusalem. That's what I see your saying that, so I can make sure.
You're gonna be on our list. I'll send it out.
Yeah, I think we do.
Asceticism,
That's right.
October, November, Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And December, Jesus in the Qur'an and the Bible. There was a January, Theodicy. And February, Revolution. March, piety. April, crucifixion of Jesus,
Yeah, that's right.
and
Yeah.
May, prayer.
Well, I
And we go for 3 months prayer.
That you mentioned how not to be secular. Okay.
Oh,
What's
so you
that?
guys don't
What's
meet
his
in,
view on that?
In the summer.
Just a kind of summary of that?
Okay.
It's.
And then,
a summary.
Or is it a,
But
like,
I mean,
a kind of a critique or?
Yeah, yeah.
You have like presenters for each one.
I mean,
So like
you
each
really
person's supposed to like
treats